and welcome to Always Take Notes.
If you're an aspiring author, you'll be excited to hear that this week's sponsors are Curtis Brown Creative, the renowned writing school affiliated to the major literary agency.
Since launching in 2011, over 150 of their students have gone on to get major book deals, including acclaimed authors Jessie Burton, Claire Pooley, and Kirsty Capes.
CBC run a wide range of courses for writers at different stages of their creative journeys. Their new 4-week online course, Plot and Story, The Deep Dive, is the perfect next step for any fiction writer struggling to weave the threads of their narrative together.
Exclusive teaching videos, resources, and writing tasks from best-selling author Laura Barnett will teach you the most useful theories of story structure and show you how to use them to shape your plot. Plus, all students will be given the opportunity to get individual feedback from one of CBC's expert fiction editors.
Visit www.curtisbrowncreative.co.uk to find out more about all the courses on offer. Curtis Brown Creative have provided an exclusive discount for Always Take Notes listeners. You can use the code ATN20 for £20 off the full price of Plot and Story, The Deep Dive, or any other 4 or 6 week online writing course.
Hello, and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with novelist and screenwriter David Nicholls.
We spoke with David about starting out as an actor, about his huge success with the novel One Day in 2009, and about his parallel career as a screenwriter.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, David, to Always Take Notes. It's brilliant to have you on the show. Could we start by talking about your decision to quit acting at the age of 29 and pursue writing? What informed that decision?
Well, it was sort of taken out of my hands, really. I was working a lot at the National Theatre, and traditionally, like the civil service, you were meant to work your way up. You were meant to get more and more opportunities and more lines. And I found the longer I was there, the less I was being given to do. And I think it was their way of saying, look, this isn't really for you. I love being at the National. I never really did anything that you would notice on stage. I was very much a company member, but I loved the institution. At the same time, I was doing things which I found much more stimulating and which I seemed to be better at. I was doing a lot of script reading, starting to think about maybe script editing as a career, developing other people's scripts, working alongside other writers. And I think, started to get positive responses to my own work. So, people were reading the scripts. I had 3 or 4 pieces of work that I could show to people, and it seemed like a good time to leave. I had a choice, actually. I remember very vividly, I was offered a job as a script reader for BBC Radio Drama, just going through the slush pile and working with new writers, and at the same time offered a world tour of 12th Night with the RSC, understudying Orlando and playing servants again. And I had to choose between the two, and I'd always wanted to be part of the RSC. It was a lovely world tour. It would have gone on for 2 years, but at the end of those 2 years, I'd have been in exactly the same position, but in my early 30s. So I turned it down and took the job at the BBC as a script reader, and alongside that started to work as a writer.
Is it right that there was also this experience playing Chekhov when you were understudying Konstantin and the Seagull? It was also a motivation.
Yeah, I did it for a long time. In Widnell and I, there's a line. It's a classic disenchanted actors line about understudying Constantine, and I did do that for 9 months at the National Theatre. My actual role was to go on stage as one of the servants at the beginning who were building the stage for the play within the play. So I had to run on in a pair of long johns with a broom and stand around at the back while Judi Dench gave this amazing performance. People like Judi Dench and Bill Nye and Helen McCrory and Alan Cox, who I was understudying. It was an amazing cast. But I never really spoke. and yet I knew the part. I could have gone on at any point. I could have. I loved the part. It was one of the very few parts that I was quite well cast as. I'd have been a good Constantine in The Seagull, but I never got to play it. Alan was always very fit and healthy, and so I just stood around at the back of the stage in a pair of long johns with a broom. I loved the play. I loved the company. I got to play it once. When you're an understudy at the National, you get to do an understudy run and you can invite a few people, but largely the theatre is empty. So I have had that experience of playing Constantine and the Seagull to a more or less empty theatre, not just any theatre, the Olivier Theatre. But it's a mixed blessing, really. It's a rather ambivalent feeling, because you're giving your all, and no one really is watching. So it was another sign, really, that maybe I should find something else to do.
I'm sure the long johns and the broom were essential to the sort of ambience of the general play.
Yeah, I don't think anyone else could have done that. I mean, I've turned it into a kind of shtick over the years, and I do feel sad that I didn't have more success. But at the same time, if I'd had any success, I wouldn't have been a writer. I'd have kept going, because even though I knew that I wasn't particularly good at it. I watched all these amazing actors who had such charisma and grace and skill and versatility, and I was okay in a very small window of a certain type of acting. I could kind of do okay, but I was never going to excel. The most I could have hoped for was to be a respected jobbing actor, and in a way that would have been wonderful. But I think I always also felt a little bit out of place at theatre, in the theatre, because I'd never really had a great love of theatre as a member of the audience. What I loved about theatre was being in a company and being engaged in the business of telling a story, characters and writing. That's what I loved. I wasn't a huge theatre goer. Even now, I don't go to the theatre very often. I always slightly kind of resent being there. I'm very intolerant of overlong, overwritten plays. I get quite bad-tempered at the theatre. I just loved the business of writing and performance. That's what I liked about theatre.
And had you had a particularly sort of a childhood steeped in performing arts and reading? I read that you went to the library sort of 2, 3, 4 times a week, but were plays a big part of that as well?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I it's no exaggeration to say I didn't really see a play until I was 16, 17. I was a TV kid. I just used to turn on the television when I got home from school and watch it as much as I could. And I loved movies in particular on television. I loved TV drama. I loved the plays of Alan Bleasdale and Dennis Potter, and I just sucked up as much as I could of soap opera, of sitcom, of stand-up, of variety. It was all television. I didn't really have any contact with theatre as a member of the audience. I was the only boy in my school who was prepared to be in the plays. And so I tended to get much bigger parts than I deserved. And it gave me this kind of false impression of my abilities, really. I liked it at that stage as a kind of social thing, as a fun thing. It wasn't that I was any good, but I was better than all the other boys because there weren't any. And so I was not steeped in theatre culture. I didn't have any expectation of being a writer. I didn't know anyone who was a writer. I didn't know anyone who worked in the performing arts or books or anything at all. No contact at all with the arts. Except through watching telly and going to the library, which I did do obsessively for many years. Yeah, I mean, my time in the library was at least as important to me as my time at school. Just working my way through the shelves in a very random, scattershot way, just picking up things that took my fancy and reading. Just finding my own way through those shelves.
And I saw this comment in another interview you'd done saying that when you went to university, you were the first person in your family to go, and your parents were simultaneously proud but also concerned, and then certainly concerned afterwards when you spent 8 years living in bedsits. Could you tell us about that experience?
Yeah. Well, I didn't really have any expectation of doing that either. Again, I didn't understand what it was. To me, education was all about turning up at the classroom and sitting exams. And I was a bit of a swot. You know, I think when you're a kid, you sort of self-mythologize a bit. And the image I built of myself was of someone who was, you know, bad at games, but a big reader and pretty good at sitting exams. And so it was my ambition to get good O-levels. And when I got to college, then this possibility of university appeared. And I didn't know anyone who'd been to university. I didn't know what students did all day. There was, at that stage, I was quite into science. I thought maybe I'd be a scientist or a zoologist or a doctor or something like that. And my A-levels were physics and biology and chemistry. But at the same time, you know, I was an obsessive reader, reading the classics and being in plays. So there was this other arty side as well. And when I did my A-levels, there was a bit of a tussle between the two. I remember the day I gave up A-level chemistry to do A-level English alongside theatre studies, and my dad was incredibly unhappy. He was a fitter, he was a mechanic. He worked in a cake factory on the production line, keeping the production line going. And so he didn't really have any point of contact with me about my passions and enthusiasms and this thing that I loved, you know, books and arty films and being in plays. It was something that was a bit of a barrier, I think, between me and my parents. And they were excited that I was going to university, and I was lucky to have in those days a full grant. Otherwise, I'd never have gone to study English and theatre studies at Bristol, which is what I did. And they were very proud, but at the same time, I know that if I'd been doing engineering or medicine, it would have been a different kind of pride. I have no complaints at all. I mean, they were very supportive, but it's always been something of a double-edged sword, I think, education can be, because it often takes you in a different direction that's perhaps away from your roots, your origins, your family. And certainly that was my experience.
And what was your experience of studying English and theatre studies? How was the course actually structured?
It was great. I was very happy, and I look back now with all kinds of with a mixture of nostalgia and regret, because I really didn't know what I was doing. You know, I was there suddenly with a lot of kids from big cities who were a lot more sophisticated, a lot more savvy, a lot more politically smart than I was, a lot more politically engaged, a lot cooler. I was gauche. I was really out of my depth, and yet I absolutely loved it. Fell in love with the city. Had a lot of very intense friendships and a lot of staying up late, putting the world to rights. All of those cliches. But yeah, I was a fool as well. You know, I didn't really know the right thing to say or the right thing to do. So I was intimidated by these what I thought rather brilliant people. It was the mid to late 80s, so it was a very political time. There was a lot of kind of anger, a lot of going on demonstrations. I very much went along with that. But the things that I was good at, you know, what I liked doing was, you know, getting cast in a play in a nice part and showing off. And the things that I liked on telly were often quite mainstream things, you know, mainstream dramas, sitcoms, that kind of thing. And suddenly I was in the world of the avant-garde, of Bauhaus and Brecht. And I didn't know anything about Pina Bausch. I didn't know anything about devising movement work. And no one ever said to me, why don't you write a play? If anything, writing a play would have seemed a bit old-fashioned. It was much more about improvisation and devising physical theatre. That wasn't really my strength. So the nearest I got to writing anything was performing sketches with my friend Matthew. I was a big comedy fan at that stage. So I loved it, but at the same time, I wasn't very cool there. I was a bit of a buffoon. I'm very grateful for that time, and the education I got there was invaluable. But I was at my most Adrian Mole-ish, I think, in those years.
And how did you end up going on to New York after you'd studied at Bristol?
It was really a kind of wild, confused stab at just doing something. I didn't really know what to do. I'd used up all my state grants, so I couldn't go to drama school, even if I could have got in. I wasn't sure that I was academically bright enough to pursue that. I thought perhaps I'd teach, but I wanted to act, and I read this thing about getting a way of getting a scholarship to study acting at this New York drama school called the American Musical and Dramatic Academy. And so on a whim, I went along and auditioned and got in, and I'd never really been abroad. I mean, I'd never been on a plane. And I'd always loved American culture, and suddenly there was the possibility of going to New York and for the most part, having it paid for. And so I got in and I went along, and I was both overawed by the experience of being in New York and also desperately lonely there. It was an academy that was very much based around musical theatre, and I couldn't sing, I couldn't dance, I could barely do the simplest choreography. I couldn't use an American accent. I was this kid who loved Shakespeare and Chekhov and Dickens, and I was very much, again, in the wrong place. Not in the wrong place, but didn't really know how to succeed there. But it was like an initiation. It was a self-inflicted rite of passage to go somewhere where I knew no one, to go abroad, to go a long way from home and stick it out for a while, which is what I did. But it didn't really move me on in terms of training or contacts. It was a kind of wild, strange, eccentric decision. The only thing that I got out of it, I suppose, in the long term was that I used to write long, desperate letters to friends telling stories about these mad musical theatre classes that I did. And I tried to make them as funny as possible. And that was the first time that I wrote at any length with the purpose of entertaining people. So in a strange kind of way, my way into writing was through letter writing, because it was a mode of writing that had a practical purpose. And some of the people I wrote to later on in their careers went on to work in TV and film, and they were always saying to me, you should do something with those letters you used to write. And that's what I did.
Could we fast forward a few years again to your script editing work? Because in other interviews you've said that was really your way into writing. What were some of the projects you worked on? And how, for listeners who might not know what script editing involves, could you sort of sketch out exactly how your time was divided?
Sure. I mean, there's a sort of in between production and the writer, there's another stage. There's a group of people called script editors who are responsible, in some ways, at a very practical level, with the business of making the script work on screen. So they give notes. They give notes about production. They give notes about scheduling. They collaborate with the writer and the producer and the director to make sure the script is as good as it can be and also practically possible to film. So they clarify inconsistencies in the story. They make sure that all the actors are given equal, the characters are given equal appropriate screen time. They make sure that the story is clear. It's an editorial role, but you do get to collaborate quite closely with writers. So on a show like EastEnders or Casualty or Coronation Street, script editors are responsible not just for organising, but also for developing certain storylines and characters. So they'll write Bibles, they'll write the background for each of the characters, they'll suggest storylines, they'll collaborate with the writer to make sure that the characters are really singing. I never really did that kind of script editing. I was much more of a development script editor. So I was reading a lot of novels. I was reading a lot of new writing. I was going to the theatre a lot, just coming up with ideas for shows. I was working with two very good producers called Sally Head and Gwenda Bagshaw at LWT. And I had an idea for a TV show for ITV, 9:00 Sunday nights, about national service. And that was my idea, and my job was to find the best possible writer who could write an ensemble, returning, multi-part, multi-series show about 1950s provincial Britain, a group of people coming together from disparate backgrounds and the adventures that came out of that situation. And I went in and pitched it, and they said, that's a great idea, let's get a writer on board. And I said, if you don't mind, I'd like to have a go myself. And I did. And that was my first 1-hour television drama. And so that's how I sort of sidestepped from storylining and writing Bibles for the characters to actually writing the dialogue and the scenes myself. At the same time, I was doing a similar thing in comedy with a sitcom based on my time working as a waiter, and working with another friend, Matthew Warchus, on an adaptation of a Sam Shepard play. So I was doing these three wildly divergent, varied projects, none of which were quite my voice, but all of which allowed me to offer up a script to producers in different forms. And that was the beginning. That's how I made the leap from script editing, which I loved, to actually script writing.
And then you had this break with Cold Feet. How did that come to pass? And what was the role that Faye Ripley played in that piece?
Well, I had an idea. I went to see a producer called Christine Langan. I'd always loved romantic comedy and kind of wanted to write one. And I had this pitch for a one-off romantic comedy. Christine had just been producing Cold Feet, which was a huge success, a kind of 90s ensemble show about relationships. And she thought that this romantic comedy idea would work great for Faye. And so I wrote a one-off for ITV called I Saw You, which was really sweet, very classic, confused identity, British rom-com of a particular kind, I suppose of a kind of Richard Curtisy kind, which went out on ITV and did very well. And that got me my first long-term writing job, which was to work alongside Mike Bullen on his show Cold Feet, this third series of Cold Feet. So suddenly I was, in script meetings and pitching ideas and writing scenes for established characters. And so Faye was very supportive of me joining the writing team of Cold Feet, and those episodes did really well. They were good, strong episodes of someone else's show, so they were a brilliant calling card for me. And I was very lucky. I think writers often kind of cast. When you're a script editor and a producer, you're trying to find writers to join a team. You're effectively casting them. You're looking at their voice and what they can do. And Cold Feet had a kind of mixture of comedy and drama that I could do, had certain romantic elements that I could do. I could write in the voices of those characters. And so it was a very good fit for me and a really big break. And I'm very grateful to that show for giving me my first leg up into television, because it was, it was a huge hit. It was getting 10, 11 million viewers and everyone was watching it at the same time. And it was very thrilling in those days before streaming, to know that 11 million people were sitting down to watch something you'd written. Next day you'd get this phone call, which was the viewing figures, and you'd hope that they'd gone up and that people hadn't turned off at the ad breaks. And it was a really exciting time. So I learned a lot. It was kind of my apprenticeship.
And what made you turn away from television to write Star to Return in 2003 and then The Understudy in 2005?
Well, again, I didn't really turn away. I was pushed out the door. I got my own shows. I got to write a longer version of I Saw You for ITV and a show called Rescue Me for the BBC. And I was really proud of both shows. And everyone at that stage was looking for the new Cold Feet, and who better to provide the new Cold Feet than someone who'd written Cold Feet? So it was a big break for me to get my first two network shows, and they were on in the same week. One on BBC One on Sunday nights, and one on ITV on Friday nights. And they're good shows, but they both slightly underperformed. It was very hard in those days to get something about relationships on the screen at 9:00 and have people watching. Cold Feet was really the only one that could do it. And so neither of them got recommissioned. And suddenly I went from having, how many hours? 9 hours of television in the space of 2 months to having no work. So I took a little time off and sulked around a little bit and wanted to write about what I was talking about earlier, about the kind of the mistakes you make when you go off to university and the class elements that lie behind education, and but to write something funny and romantic about going to university. It's very hard to write about being a student without just rambling on about drunken nights at the student union. So watching University Challenge one night, I thought, well, look, this is a funny hook to hang the story off, because it's sort of a sports movie. It's about qualifying and then making it to the semi-finals and making it to the finals. And the idea that someone would try and win someone's heart through general knowledge seemed like a funny idea. So I managed to combine my own feelings about education and my experience at university with this firmer, not gimmick, but a framework, a structure that would make it something more than just a lot of anecdotes about getting drunk. And that was seemed like a good idea for a television series, but I knew that no one would commission it as a television series, and so I wrote it as a novel. And so, yes, like many things that I've done, it was born out of failure, really, born out of necessity to find something else to work on.
Did you then, because clearly you were back writing TV, fairly soon after that, and as those two sides developed, did you decide consciously that you were going to continue do novels and TV and film in parallel, or did it just evolve? And it's interesting because we had William Boyd on the show, who said that he'd made a pretty deliberate decision that he was going to develop these two different tracks of writing prose fiction, but also writing for the screen. But he regarded them as very separate activities. But how did it work for you with those two different pieces?
Well, I found that I found writing for television very exciting, but also absolutely terrifying, and later for film as well. If anything, film is more frightening because it's such a precarious make or break opening weekend kind of high stakes gamble. And the process of making it, getting through all that development, getting into production, is incredibly stressful in both TV and film. At the same time, I didn't want to stop doing it. What I did want to stop doing was writing so much, because I'm not the kind of writer, I'm not like Russell T Davies or one of those great talented writers who can write 10 or 12 or 15 hours or 3 series, 4 series of a show. I don't have that much story in me. I'm much happier writing something self-contained, or something, a 2-hour movie or 3-hour miniseries. I can't come up with that much material. So I knew I wasn't very good at writing series. At the same time, I fell in love with writing prose, where you do have arguments, and you do have notes, and you do have edits to do, but it's much less fraught, and you have much more control, because there's you're not collaborating with anyone really except your editor and a few other people at the publishing house. So I fell in love with writing prose, and I didn't want to stop writing scripts. So I have kept both up consciously, and that's been just about manageable. I mean, especially because recently what I've done more of is adaptation, where you have such a strong framework before you set out that it's almost more of a making it. Saying that it's a technical job isn't quite right, because that it suggests that you're doing it in a rather cold, clinical way, which I don't. I get just as emotional about an adaptation as I would about an original script. But I would find it very hard to write a novel in the morning and an original screenplay in the afternoon. But I can keep both projects in my mind if one is a novel and the other is an adaptation of someone else's work that I love. And so that tends to have been what I've done for the last 15 years. I would hate to find out that I was never going to have another script produced, commissioned or produced. At the same time, I'm not a very... I find it really hard to write fiction unless it's something I feel very strongly about, unless it's a compulsion, and unless I feel pretty confident that it's a story that needs to be told. So I'm not as prolific as a novelist as I'd like to be, because the actual business of writing a book, the practicalities of it, the process is generally speaking a little less horrifyingly tense than making a TV show or a film.
Could we talk a little bit about your process when it comes to adaptations, both in terms of adapting other people's work, Thomas Hardy, the Patrick Melrose novels, and what it's like, how that compares with adapting your own work? How do you go about adaptation in both instances?
Well, the first stage if I'm adapting someone else's work I have to learn it, and I learn it by reading it and reading it and reading it and annotating the copy, and often listening to it. With Patrick Melrose, I listened to all 5 books on audio for years. I mean, for the years that we spent developing it, it's all I listened to as I walked around London. till you know it backwards, and then you can it goes through a strange, almost like it's a sieve in your mind. You know, the bits that sing out for you, the bits you look forward to, the bits that make you laugh even though you've read them or listened to them 10 or 15 times. You start to build your own version of that story in your mind, and that's what you write down in the screenplay. You try and convey what you love and are passionate about in the book, and select it and organize it to make it work on screen. The hardest thing with any adaptation of a book is the lack of an interior voice. Screenwriting is often about trickery. How do you tell the viewer that what someone's name is, or that they're brother and sister, not lovers? You know, how do you put this stuff onto the screen when you're not able to do the very, very, very simple thing you can do in a book, which is just to tell the reader, I was feeling rather sad that day. Fine, in the script, in a novel, that's it. That's all you have to write. In a screenplay, what are you going to do? Are you going to put it into dialogue? Are you going to put it into stage direction? If it's dialogue, who are they going to talk to? Because we don't often express our feelings out loud. So there's a huge amount of trickery involved. In terms of adapting my own book, accepting that you are going to lose 90% of the text, that you're going to lose all of that inner voice, that you're going to lose all of the commentary that runs alongside the dialogue, and that all you're really going to be able to take are the events, the actions, and the dialogue. That's really tough. And it's especially tough with your own work because often there's a story behind the story. There's a set of experiences. There's that potentially mean quite a lot to you. I've never really, put real life characters from my life onto the page, but certainly a lot of my feelings and experiences have been filtered through fiction and found their way there. And then suddenly you have to develop an incredibly callous, ruthless attitude to this material and throw most of it away. And so it's quite painful. And the only thing that's more painful is letting someone else do it. So you have to accept that process before you start. There's no point grumbling about it. You have to just accept that all those great jokes that you love, all those things that on the page people say, oh, I love the scene where, chances are you're going to have to cut a lot of it because it just won't make sense on screen. And that's tough. And I don't get that same kind of sense of loss. God, I'm being very melodramatic about it, but it doesn't bother me quite so much if the book belongs to Thomas Hardy rather than me.
Hello, it's Artemis, the producer of Always Take Notes. I hope you're enjoying Simon and Rachel's conversation with the novelist and screenwriter, David Nicholls. You're about to hear the next instalment of our new segment. In this segment, you'll hear previous guests of the show answer one of 3 questions. What's a piece of advice you wish you'd had at the start of your career? When is a time you failed? And what's the most important trait someone in your profession can have? Their answers weren't included in the main interviews that Simon and Rachel did with them, so hopefully they give you some fresh insight into the careers of some of the fascinating guests that we've had on. So, without further ado, here's the magazine writer and investigative journalist, Mei Zhong, with a piece of advice she wished she'd had at the start of her career.
The first thing that comes to mind is go before you're ready. I think there's a tendency to want to get all your ducks and drakes in a row, but ultimately you can't inoculate yourself from all eventualities. You just need to go and do it. And if you're a reasonably thoughtful person, chances are very high that you are likely very ready, and I think you should just go for it. And also, as I'm saying, though, I'm realizing that life lessons, or what are these called, advice, is quite useless in many ways, because for the giver, they come after the fact, and when you don't really have much need for it. And also, what I've learned in my life is that suggestions and recommendations are often quite specific. I mean, I think the reason why I say go before you're ready is because I feel like I committed the crime of wanting to over prepare and you can't really live like that.
That was Mei Zhong. Now back to Simon and Rachel's conversation with David Nicholls.
A point that's come up with other screenwriters we've had on the show has been the evolution from a kind of traditional British model of a single writer with a script editor to this more American style of having a showrunner and a writer's room and stuff like that. And how, with your work and as your career has developed, how have you been between those two different practices?
Well, a couple of times I've been offered projects which I really liked, and people have said, but they've been 8 or 10 or 12 parts. Often American projects, and I've said I can't do this. It's 2, 3, 4 years of my life. I want to write fiction, and they've said, well, you don't have to write it all. You can be a showrunner, and there's something for a British writer that sounds quite glamorous about this. You have this vision of studio lots in California and walking into the room and standing in front of a whiteboard and talking to lots of exciting young writers, but being the boss. And I've realized very, very, very early on that I did not want to do that. That temperamentally I wasn't really prepared to do that I could never, I would find it hard to rewrite someone else's script in front of them. That the reasons that you would employ a writer to join your writer's room is because you admire their work, but not so much that you're not prepared to throw most of it out. I would have found the etiquette of that very difficult. And of course, there are lots of writers who are very professional, very objective and calm about that kind of process. But I didn't think it was my role. And so I've never worked in a writer's room, not since Cold Feet. I've never wanted to. I've always been much happier writing scripts that are more contained, but are all my own work. And so far, I haven't yet been overwritten. I'm sure I will be one day, but I know that I would find that hard, and I would expect any writer that I was working with to find it hard if I wrote over the top of their script as well. At the same time, shows benefit from it. The reason why these shows are often so dense with great lines and great jokes is because this kind of ruthless stuff has gone on. And definitely I've written things in the past that would have benefited from other writers' input. It's just not something I'm very good at or comfortable with, and I'm much happier to do shows which have a smaller volume, aren't necessarily going to come back for 2 or 3 or 4 series, but which are all my own work.
If we could return to the sort of chronology of your career again, One Day, obviously mega hit in 2009. At what point did you know it was going to be huge?
Well, there's a bit where the proofs go out and you wait for people to pick them up and read them, and often not as many people read them as you hoped, and they sort of sit around on people's shelves, and you never really hear anything until the book comes out. But with One Day, there was a kind of word of mouth even before it was published that people were having a very positive response to the proof copies, and they became quite sought after. And that was really exciting. At the same time, my second book, after Start of 10, The Understudy, hadn't done very well at all. And with One Day, I didn't have any... With my first book, I'd had this terrific leg up of it being a Richard and Judy pick. That wasn't the case with my second book, and it wasn't the case with One Day. So there was I think, in my mind, a sense that this probably was going to be the last of my books, and very much... my writing fiction career anyway was on a downward trajectory, but yeah, the buzz started to build, and then when it came out in hardback, even though my previous book hadn't done well, the sales started to pick up, and people really seemed to really respond to it. I think it had a good premise. It had what they call in Hollywood a high concept, and the high concept got talked about a lot as well. And so I started to get letters, and I started to get quite emotional letters, and there was a sense of excitement at the publishers as well, and it was thrilling. It was exactly what I'd hoped for from the book. I'd always wanted it to be a book that people had a big emotional response to. I've talked in the past about it being like a big old pop song that isn't quite happy, isn't quite sad, but is sort of tugs at your heart. And that was the intention. And it was one of those relatively rare occurrences where the intention seemed to be fulfilled.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it interacts with people's writing lives. So be as candid or as guarded as you'd like to be, but with not just with One Day, but before that, and then when you had this huge hit, how has the financial side of all of this kind of developed and worked for you?
Well, I've been very lucky. I've been lucky in that I've managed. Even before One Day, I'd managed to make a living as a writer. It was looking quite precarious after a couple of shows hadn't gone particularly well quite early in my career, but once I'd started combining fiction and film and television, I was doing okay. And I suppose with One Day, it was a bit like I know some theatre directors, and what they always kind of long for is a show in the West End that will run, but will allow them to go off and do other things and take some of the pressure off the requirement to keep doing work that they don't necessarily love. And for me, that's One Day. It sells enough copies a year for me to carry on, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. Even after 10 years, it still has these little flurries where someone picks it up and tweets about it, and it has a little push in sales, and that's great. So I that's my pension, and I'm very, very, very lucky as a writer to have that, because the other areas that I work in, TV and film, are quite precarious. It's very rare for a writer to write successfully as a screenwriter for 40 or 50 years. You go through highs and lows, and I'm sure I will. I'm sure that's all ahead of me. But I'm lucky to have the security of at least one big success that will tide me over, I hope.
What was it like writing a novel after that? I read that you had a very long publicity tour for the book, sort of 3 years, and also that sort of creatively it was quite difficult, that you binned a manuscript of 30,000 words the next time you tried to write. Was it difficult to follow that hit?
Yeah, it was horribly difficult. I mean, again, I don't want to feel sorry for myself, because I was busy. I was being asked to do fantastic things and travel the world and go to all these places I'd never dreamed of, and it was very easy and pleasant to talk about One Day. I could have done it for a lot longer, but there came a point where I had to kind of clear my head, and I got all the copies out of the office and actually moved somewhere else to work, and a completely bare space, and thought, right, get on with it, do something else. But I think the worst thing that happens is you become very self-conscious, because you start to ask what people want, and not just what people want in the UK, but what people want in Brazil. What do they want around the world? What do they want to read next? I think also, philosophically, well, not philosophically, that's a bit high-minded, but you start to think about what kind of writer you are. I don't mind reading writers whose books are all largely the same, who come back again and again to the same themes, the same situations and characters. John le Carre didn't sit down and think, I better not write anything else about disillusioned spies. It's fine that he's John le Carre. At the same time, I like a lot of artists who are always surprising me, who are always doing completely new things, writing in new styles and new forms about new subjects. What are you going to be? Are you going to show your versatility, or are you going to produce One Day too, but do it really to the best of your abilities and not be embarrassed by it? It's a real dilemma. Sally Rooney's new book has just come out, and a lot of the discussion has been about the kind of writer she is, the kind of world she writes about, the kind of characters she writes about. I think it's a terrific book. I'm really enjoying it, and I'm pleased that she hasn't tried to write something that's outside her range. I think the analogy with acting is quite good. Often actors who are very good on one thing try to show their versatility and fall on their faces. And at the same time, you have to admire actors who take bold choices and take chances. And it's the same with writers. So you can tell I've thought about this a lot, because I'm going on at far too much length. But I will say that it was very hard. And what I decided in the end was that I had to write something that I felt passionate about. And I was a little bit older by this stage, and I'd become a parent, and it didn't seem appropriate for me to write another kind of 20-somethings falling in love novel set around bars and nightclubs in London, when what I was really doing was dealing with the business of parenthood. And at the same time, my own father was starting to become ill, and I was thinking about not just being a father, but being a son. And so that became the focus of the follow-up, Us. And once I'd kind of decided that's what I was going to write about, that I was going to write about marriage and family and parenthood rather than 20-somethings dating and falling in love, then that actually came quite easily. And it's a book that I'm very proud of. I think Us is a better book than One Day. And I love it. And even though I knew it was never going to sell as many copies, I think it was the right book to write. Though there were moments, I remember when One Day came out. One Day was a big success in Italy, and I used to go to these book events, and there were lots of young people in their 20s, at most 31, 32, and I would sign the books for them afterwards. And then 4 or 5 years later, doing the same thing with Us, I realized that I was signing the books for their parents, not for them, and that I'd kind of lost this younger audience and was definitely appealing to a slightly older crowd now. And I think that's fine. I think that's inevitable and far more dignified than continuing to try and write something that isn't really your experience or your world.
Is it right that you were quite influenced by John Cheever when you were writing Us? Because that's, I came across Cheever's stuff when I lived in the States, and I found it fascinating, but it's quite dark, like Milo.
It is dark. Yeah, I mean, often these associations are quite veiled and obscure. But I suppose the thing I took from Cheever was a sense of, normal, conventional, conservative suburban life that nevertheless conceals great passion. That's the key thing with Cheever. That it's about guys who get on the same train every day and go and have rather boring, unfulfilling jobs and seemingly conventional family lives, but who nevertheless are just on the edge of falling to pieces. And that's a kind of recurring theme, not just in Cheever, but in a lot of American writing. And I think, if anything, as a novelist, I am more influenced by American writing than British writing. Americans write so well about family and marriage and parenthood and so about domestic situations. But with the great American novel is probably a domestic novel in our minds, and so Cheever was definitely in there. Yes, the difficult stuff that bubbles away under seemingly conventional lives. Cheever isn't very funny, and I hope that Us is funny, but it was definitely one of a raft of influences.
One of the themes that comes up when we speak to novelists is whether they're a plotter, someone who works out the arc and the outline of the story before they start writing, whether they plunge in and sort of see where the characters take them. Do you fall in one of those camps? Are you somewhere in between? And is there a similar process for screenwriting, or how do you actually write a novel or a script?
That's changed a lot over the years. When I submitted, when I started writing Start of a 10, I gave to my publisher a sort of 15-page chapter-by-chapter breakdown, which is what I would do for an episode of Cold Feet. And I'd never really seen a document like this before. But for me, it was a way of giving me confidence, really. You know that even if you can't write the 4th chapter, you may be able to write the 7th chapter. That there'll be something further along that you're going to enjoy writing. And that if you put all of these things together, even though some story elements will be better than others, it will tell a whole arc, a complete story. And so the first 3 novels were quite carefully plotted in a way that was pretty close to how I would approach an hour of original television. With an A story, a B story, points at which they intertwine, a character Bibles. I've moved away from that less. With Us, Us had this... Us had a definite structure before I started, but I didn't plot it out quite so precisely. And with my last book, Sweet Sorrow, that was prepared for, but it was preparation for that was much looser. It was much more about a mood. This sounds a bit pretentious, but there was a kind of mood board for it, a sense of summer fading into autumn, certain pieces of music, certain landscapes. I wrote about 70,000 words over the course of about 18 months, but none of it you would really call a novel. It was just a lot of sketches, a lot of improvised dialogue. So often preparation, when people talk about preparing for a novel, inevitably you think of storylines and plots. And actually, for me, preparation is as much about mood, characters and their backgrounds, voice, point of view, the tense in which you're going to write it, the tone in which you're going to write it, whether it's first person or third person. All of that stuff I do need to know, even if I don't need to know exactly the exact location where X meets Y or what Z says to B. I can improvise within a framework, but I need to know what I want to achieve with the book as a whole. So I do prepare. I would never, every time I try to improvise something, I've always ended up throwing it away. But the preparation is often quite abstract and a mood rather than bare bone story elements.
Could you tell us a bit more about this role that music plays in your process? And I was seeing that again with Sweet Sorrow, it's saying that you kind of described sort of listening to sort of earnest student music, the kind of music you listen to when you're that age and you suddenly want to share your great taste with people. And this really struck me because we recently spoke with Elif Shafak for the podcast, and she says she listens to like thrash metal while she writes, which seemed fascinating. But how does music kind of fit together with the way you work?
Yes, isn't that amazing? Well, it used to be that I could just listen to pop music all the time while I was writing, certainly when I wrote Start of a Tent, because what music does when you start writing is it makes you less aware of the silence in the room and your terrible existential loneliness. You think that there's something going on in the room and you're going to start writing, and that's fine. And what you're hoping for is that the music is going to stop, the album's going to finish, and you're not going to notice because you've been swept away in this imaginary world. So when I began writing, I used to listen to a lot of music from the year in which I was writing, for instance, or music that I thought the characters would like. And so, yes, every novel up until a certain point did have a soundtrack. With One Day, there's a kind of scene where Dexter has a sort of breakdown at a terrible nightclub, and I wrote that to the kind of music you would listen to in a nightclub in 1997, I think it is. I can't do that anymore. I mean, now I find it hard to drive a car if the radio's on, so I don't have the kind of I don't have that clear vision. So I now listen to, I do sometimes just need something to get me started, and I listen to a lot of Bach keyboard music. I listen to the well-tempered clavier most days just to get me going, and then the dream is that it stops and you don't notice. But more often than not now, I find it a distraction, and I don't need it quite as much, in the same way that I don't need it in my life quite as much as I used to. I used to, in my 20s, hate being in a room that didn't have music playing, but now I'm calmer about it. I certainly do use it to sum up a mood, if I want to get into a particular frame of mind, but I can't listen to lyrics while I'm typing anymore.
Yeah, I read that when you were doing One Day, the Billy Bragg song, Since Within Stage, which is obviously the day which all the scenes sort of unfurl from, helped when you were stuck with words and tone.
Yes, absolutely. And, there were a couple of other touchstones for that book. Because it was a book where the characters get together in the late 80s, early 90s, I was listening to a lot of things like Massive Attack, and the mood and the lyrics of Protection by Massive Attack. That was kind of the theme song of that book. But there are all kinds of other elements. I was talking earlier about how I wanted it to be like a big, jubilant pop song, and I thought a lot about I Say a Little Prayer by Aretha Franklin, which does this wonderful shifting between major and minor keys, and that was another theme song. And St. Swithin's Day, that line about the Polaroids that hold us together will surely fade away, that sense of nostalgia and lost love. That was another touchstone for that song. It was a song that I was listening to a lot in 1988 when the novel began. It was a song that lyrically fitted the themes of memory and nostalgia in the book. And it was a song that mood-wise summed up a lot of the melancholy that's in the book. So, yeah, music can be a key, but now I can't use. I don't use it as such a in such an intense way. And when I was writing Us, Douglas is someone who actually doesn't really get music, and so there wasn't a soundtrack to Us. Music is one of the arts that Douglas finds a bit intimidating and confusing, and Douglas only listens to sort of Mozart as a sort of sedative. He doesn't love music in the way that Connie, his wife, does. So, but it's always there. I think it's a good way of showing who characters are, and it's also a good way of as a writer, of just leading you into a mood or a location or time and place.
We're coming up towards the end of our time, but a final question from me was that you've spoken before about your experience of insomnia and also anxiety, and how have those experiences kind of fitted with your creativity and your writing throughout your career?
Yeah, it's definitely made it harder, I think. I think it's very hard. A lot of what I was writing when I set out was comic writing. And at various times, over the last 20 years, I've been a bit depressed and anxious. And it's very hard to sit down and think, right, let's knock out 300 brilliantly funny words when you're spending a lot of the rest of your day staring into space and trying not to panic and worrying about how you're going to get through the night. It's hard. And I think probably some of that anxiety and melancholy has found its way onto the page. Certainly themes of depression and anxiety are in Us and Sweet Sorrow, and a little bit in One Day as well. The insomnia, I'm a little bit more, I was going to say zen, but I don't know what that means. But I'm a little less frantic about it now. I sleep a little better, if only because now I'm a parent. I'm often physically quite drained and exhausted anyway. But it does sometimes make writing in a certain mode not just difficult, but impossible. But I'm lucky in that I have, often have 2 or 3 things on the go at the same time, and so I can turn my attention somewhere else if I know that I'm not going to write something brilliantly funny in my current state of mind. I mean, I suppose if I feel sad about anything, it's that I really love comedy, and I don't think I write it in the same way as I used to. I used to love the comedy of embarrassment and humiliation, and Start of a Tennis full of awful things happening to Brian in a way that I probably couldn't do now because I find it too sad and awful. And so now I suppose the comedy is maybe a little bit less farcical and outrageous and a little bit more rueful and bittersweet. That's a word I try not to use, but there it is. That said, I think Sweet Sorrow, the last book, is probably, it's both the funniest but also the saddest of the 5 I've written. So I'd love to write something that was just purely, unashamedly, joyously, outrageously funny. And maybe I will, but who knows?
Final question for me was going to be was asking about a passion project, what you'd like to do. I read that you'd like to adapt Tender as the Night, and in fact have written a script of it, but it's not been produced. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, I've written Tender as the Night is a book I really loved in my 20s, and again was in a weird kind of way an influence on Us. I mean, Scott Fitzgerald is about as far away from my writing style as it's possible to get. There's a kind of lyricism and a kind of doomed poetry to his books, especially Tender as the Night. There's none of that in my books really. But Us was influenced by Tender as the Night in the sense of a couple falling apart as they travel around Europe, and a very fluid movement between the past and the present. And it's a novel I've always loved. Now I must admit I love it a little less than I used to. I think it's the way you feel about books changes as you grow older. I know that if I were to read Tess now, for instance, I don't know if I would be as forgiving, not just of the characters, but of Thomas Hardy as I was when I read it. And so sometimes your allegiances change slightly and your passion projects alter too as you go along. So in a way, if I'm passionate about anything, it's the book I've yet to write. I've always written, with fiction in particular, the last three books in particular, they were very heartfelt, and I'd love to find that kind of sense of something that needs to be said again. And so if I imagine myself as a happy, passionate writer, it's writing book number 6. I just don't know what it is yet.
Well, David, look, thank you for being a fantastic guest on Always Take Notes, and wishing you all the best with your all your projects going forward.
I hope I haven't babbled on, but thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with David Nicholls. He's not on Twitter currently, but his latest book, Sweet Sorrow, is published by Hodder and Stoughton. We wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards, including a shout out on the show and a selection of successful magazine pitches.
If you pledge $10 a month, you also get a free 2-month trial to Otter, worth $26, alongside the other rewards. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help when organising interview material.
Thanks again for supporting Always Take Notes.
Hello, it's us again. Simon, what was your takeaway from the interview with David?
He was extremely affable. This was the thing that really stuck with me. He seemed a very kind of gracious and kind man when we spoke to him. I thought it was also interesting how, he'd had this parallel career as an actor before moving into writing, which I suppose has some overlays with Johnny Geller, who we had a while ago, who was an actor before going into agenting, but obviously different. And I do think that people who come at writing novels from the medium of TV and drama maybe come at it in a different and perhaps more open-minded way. What do you think?
Yeah, I found the discussion of the evolution of his career fascinating, particularly the sort of juggernaut hit that was One Day, and also, given my interest in the craft of screenwriting, how that's worked, and the fact that he kind of didn't enjoy the involvement in One Day, but now is very hands-on in the adaptations of his work. So that was fascinating to hear about. What have you been up to outside of Always Take Notes?
I've been closing a magazine piece for 1843, so doing the kind of final bits and bobs for that. And I had my big thing in the London Review of Books last week, which was on the cover, so that was nice and had some very nice feedback. What about you, Rachel?
I am going away shortly, so I'm taking a huge stack of proofs with me, including some authors that we should probably try and get on the show. So I'm looking forward to digging into that. And I've also signed up for some freelance script reading stuff. So I'm looking forward to getting stuck into that. I think that's kind of April, May time. So yeah, good to use the skills that I've learned on the course.
Excellent. This has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphics are by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Twitter at Take Notes Always, on Instagram at Always Take Notes. You can support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon under Always Take Notes, and if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.